Now they got the brake assembly, the parking brake assembly mounted onto the truck. It's time to put the spindle on there. The first thing I'm going to do is clean up this spindle, make sure it's absolutely pristine. An oil-filled hub, it's a lot easier to clean up than a grease-filled hub like you have on the front end of a car or truck or a trailer, something like that. On those, though, this thing would be full of grease. Here most of the oil is run out of it, and but you still want to get everything out of it. On any of them, you want to clean them all completely out, make sure any grit or debris or anything is not in it. But you also have to make sure and clean them out to get all the old grease and oil in it, unless you're absolutely sure that the oil that you're using and grease that you're using is exactly the same as what was in it before. If there's any chance at all that it's not exactly the same brand, type, and everything of grease or oil that was in it, you got to make sure that it's cleaned out perfectly, because there's different types of oils. Even though they meet the same specs and stuff, there's different carriers on them. There's basically two different types, and they're not compatible. And if you mix the two of them together, they actually will have a chemical reaction and will cause corrosion and cause your bearing failure and stuff, everything in there to fall apart. And so you don't want that to happen. So it's best just to clean every residual bit of grease out of there. And I'm just using paint thinner. Stoddard solvent would work, gasoline would work, just about any kind of solvent. I don't like the water-based stuff, but most of the petrochemical based stuff's all right. Anything that doesn't leave any residue in there. There's two main parts to the bearing. There's the bearing itself, and then there's the outer race. And this outer race is pressed into this hub, and it can be changed if it gets scarred up or messed up, or if your bearings go bad. You want to change these races out. The races and bearings should come as a set, and they should be changed together. So this is the front race, and this is the back one, and they're looking pretty good. Now, washing the bearing out, as these bearings should have been pretty clean because they were all in clean oil and they were in good shape, but they sat out on the bench for a while and get dirt and dust on them and stuff. But I want to make sure and get all the oil off of them, and I'm inspecting it at the same time. I'm inspecting all of these rollers, looking for any chips, any wear, any scratches, anything like that. You can see chips in the face of those if they get rattled. The other thing is how much wear, how much play there is. See, this is the inner race here, and then you have the tapered roller bearings here, and the inner race is slightly tapered and the outer race is tapered, and they fit together. There's a little bit of axial play and a little play back and forth, and that's why you preload those, is to push those in to get the play out of them like that, so that they're fit in there tight. But you don't want to force them in there too tight, because if they're too tight, then that will push the grease and oil away from the two surfaces. Ideally, you want grease and oil to separate this metal surface here on these roller bearing from the race, both on the inside of the hub and on the outside of the hub. The seal is actually two parts. You have this portion of the seal that has the lip on it, and then you have an inner portion that's the race that it, or the portion that it fits in, and in this portion here has got rubber on it. It actually seals, presses on to the spindle shaft and seals. This rubber is actually a tight seal here, and then the outer seal spins on it, so the lip spins on this portion, inside portion of this seal, rather than on the steel portion of the spindle like a regular seal is. If you replace the bearings, new bearings will come wrapped in an oil wrapper, and they'll have oil on them, and you want to wash the new bearings off and get that oil off of them before you use them or before you pack them, because that new oil, or that oil that's on the bearings, is just a preservative oil. It's not a lubricating oil, and if you leave it on there, it can cause the bearings to go bad not by not allowing the proper lubricant to get in there to them, or mixing with the lubricant that's on them that you put in them. So even new bearings fresh out of the box should be washed. Now this happens to be the hub for the right hand wheel, the rear axle. It's exactly the same, it's identical to the left hand one. They use exactly the same parts, the same bearings, the same seals. If it was brand new, a replacement part, you could switch them. Wouldn't make any difference which side on which, but once they've been used, they kind of take a seat to each other, and they kind of wear in. So you don't want to interchange them. We want to keep this one separate from the left hand and make sure it goes on the right hand side. And it's the same thing with these bearings. The bearings are exactly the same part number. They're identical. When you buy them, they can't come in a box. It's just exactly the same. They should come with an inner race, or the outer race, I should say, the race that presses into these hubs. It should come with those to mate up with them, as you should change the bearing in a set with the race. But you don't want to get them mixed up. You don't want to take and mix up this bearings, even though they're identical. You want to keep them separated and keep the right hand bearings on the right hand hub and the left hand bearings on the left hand hub. And if you change them, you change them as a pair with the races. Once they wear a little bit and wear in, they kind of take a seat and wear into each other. Now, you could put them together and not run into any problems, but ideally you want to keep them together, keep them on the same parts that have already been worn into each other. Now these hubs operate in an oil bath. They get oil that comes from the differential through the axle tube and axle housing and right into this hub, and there's an oil level in this hub that keeps them lubricated, and that's actually a really good lubrication method. But because we're putting this all together dry and changing all the oil in it and stuff, I'm going to put a little bit of grease on these bearings just to make sure that they have grease on them when they go together, so they don't start out dry running dry. And this grease, I'm using synthetic grease and oil in these, and the differential, and I'm using AMSOIL, so I made sure and got the same type of, or a grease that's compatible with the oil that I'm going to be using with these bearings. So I just take a little bit of grease. I'm not going to pack these bearings like I would for a front axle. I'm not going to pack them full, as eventually this oil is going to dissolve this grease, and it should float these bearings. But I want to make sure that the oil and the grease are compatible with each other. I'm going to put a little bit of this oil. This is the differential oil. And I want to put a little bit of it right down in that seal to pre-lube that seal. And then spin that seal so that it gets down in there. I'm going to smear a little bit of grease right around the edge of this hub where that seal goes in there. And the reason I'm spreading it around on the hub instead of on the seal itself is so that when I push that seal down in there, it pushes the grease down with the seal. And if I put it on the seal itself, when I push the seal down in there, the grease would be pushed out and it would come out the back, out the side, and kind of make a mess there. This way it's lubricating the seal seat, and it's not pushing it out to where it's going to pick up any dirt or anything once it gets out and on the truck. I've got a seal driver set. This is one of the plates for it. Another one, a little bit larger. Unfortunately, this is the largest one, and it's not near big enough for driving that seal in there. So I've got this aluminum plate, and this is what I cut out to use to clamp on here when I sandblasted that and powder coated it. So I'm going to put that over the top of that and just you kind of want to go around evenly around it, and that seats that in there pretty darn good. I'll get a little bit. Okay, that's seated in there pretty good, and there's no squeeze out of grease around this outside edge, which is what I wanted. Okay, this hub is pretty much ready to go. That's pretty clean and pretty nice. I'm going to put a little bit of grease in there on that race. And that hub is ready to go on the truck. I'm ready to put the hub on there, and I'm going to wipe this spindle down with a clean rag and just a little bit of solvent just to make sure and get any dirt, grit, anything that fell on there while it was sitting here. I put a little bit of grease around the inside of this hub so that when I put that seal on there, it would slide in a little bit easier, and it would help seal up anything in that hub and keep it from seizing to the hub for the next time it comes off. And then I got a little bit of differential lubricant and put on that seal on the inside of the lip and spun it enough so that it was lubricated, and put a little bit of grease on the inner face of that seal so that it slides on. It goes over this edge right here on this spindle. I don't want to put grease on that spindle, because when I put it on there, then the hub would push the grease out behind it and it'd come off and get into the brake. So by putting it on the inside of this seal, when I put it on there, it's going to push it into the hub. So this is where the seal rides on right here. This ridge right here, the bearing will butt up against it, and then the bearing rides on this spindle right here. Then it's reduced down in diameter here, and then there's another shoulder here, and then it's reduced down some more, and the outer bearing rides on this spindle here, and then the nut goes in, tightens up against the bearing, and pushes this hub so that the rear bearing is pressed tight against that shoulder back here, and the front bearing is tight against that axle nut, and that's what preloads the bearings. So I can slide this on, and that one actually went on a little bit onto the seal. Now this outer bearing, the smaller one, goes on next, and again I just pre-lubed it with a little bit of grease. I didn't fill it up because I want the oil to flow through this bearing to get in here, to get into that rear bearing and fill that hub up. So it's got enough grease on it to get it started and lubricate it for a start. Okay, now we got to tighten that nut up. Now I've got my homemade spindle spanner here. I put that in there, tighten that nut up. That's easier than trying to do it with the fingers. Now we're doing two things here. The first thing we have to do, tighten this nut up, is to push that seal in tight on that spindle. And with a regular oil seal, it would have gone on pretty easy. It slipped on and you go right into the bearing preload right away. But this one went on fairly decent. So that's preloading the bearing. I'm going to tighten that down pretty tight. preload that bearing. See, that bearing is tighter than hell now. It won't turn. That spindle just barely turns. I'm going to turn it a little bit. Make sure that it's on there all the way. It gets seated. And I can't tighten that nut up anymore. Now we've got notches in here, keyways cut in this nut, and one keyway in the spindle. And so we'll back that nut off. First thing we're going to do is back it off to the first place where the key will match up with that. And I'm pretty sure that's going to be too tight. Yeah, that's way too tight. So we'll back it off to the next one. That loosened that nut up pretty good. There we go. Line it up to it. Oh yeah, that's pretty good there. Yeah, that's just the friction, mainly in the seal that I'm feeling there. So that's pretty good right there. I'm going to go with that. I got my clean key. It'll fit in there like that. We've got the keeper. And it goes in like that. And it just goes in, and got a little tag end on that spring assembly that's bent down. It fits into that key slot. And then this thing just rides in the threads. There we go. Okay, that's the way it fits. Now it's down in those threads, and so it won't come out unless you put this underneath it and pop it out. So that's good. Now pull that out of there. I'll take the axle. Yeah, I've taken the axle and washed it off, wiped it down, make sure there doesn't transfer any crud in there, because that's oil and everything goes on to that. And I've put my gasket that I made on the axle. I'm going to smear a little bit of grease on this face of this hub. Now, you could use gasket cement or something on there if you wanted to. But I'm just using some grease. Now the grease will help this keep this gasket stuck there in position. And the other thing that it'll do is the oil and the grease will help swell up that gasket. The gasket will soak that up, that grease up, and so it makes a better seal. Like I said, you could use gasket cement or RTV or something in there spread thin, and it would work too. Now I have to kind of cantilever the axle up a little bit so that it goes into the position, and it slid in, the splines slid in there. The splines are in the hub, in the differential, and so I got to line these holes up in the hub here and keep the holes for this gasket lined up at the same time so they don't get torn. There we go. Now it's lined up with that one. Okay, now I got to go on an Easter egg hunt and find those other 3 bolts. They're here someplace. They rolled off my bench. I got to go turn the air on, get the air wrench to torque those down some more. It's spinning when I turn it with the wrench. But the final torque down will be when I get the wheels on, the tires on, and put it on the ground. I won't be able to get a good purchase on it until I get it on the ground. Then I'll check the torque on them. Maybe I just got this cocked. No, I just got that cocked. Alright, they're spin free, so that's good. That's where it's going to be. So I got my little keeper. Put it in there. And hold that caliper on there, or that rotor on there. I mean, I say caliper all this time. Brake pad carrier here, ready to go on. I'll get one of my bolts in there. Okay, I'll get the second bolt started in there, the bottom one, if I can. No reason why I can't. There we go. This is a 13/16. I'm just going to tighten it up a little bit now with a ratchet just to keep it, to get it to stay on there, maybe. Too much crap in the way here. Can't quite get that ratchet in there and around that spring. All right, that one's on. So it's probably metric. I don't know what size metric corresponds to 13/16, but there it is. That's on. I want to get I'm going to spray some white lithium inside these boots here. And these pins go in these boots, and they've got a notch on each end of them and the corresponding portion on the boot that locks down into that. One of these was pretty pitted up, pretty crudded up. I got it cleaned up, all the rust and crap off of it, but it's pretty pitted. They're CAD plated, and of course the CAD plating's gone off of this one, so it should be replaced, but I'll put it in there now. And I think it was the bottom one, so I'm going to go ahead and stick it in the top. And come on, going in there. There we go. Now on the other side there, you got both of them in. Yeah, let's see if we can't get that thing on there. Okay, there we go. Now we got it. All right. So let's put this other pin in. That one started. Okay, they're starting a little bit hard for some reason. That one is. Takes a 13mm wrench to get it in there. The head of the bolt's 13mm. Should have brought a ratchet, I guess, since it won't go in by hand all the way. Well, I cleaned those holes out and the threads off on the screws. You'd think they'd go in there a little easier, but they don't want to go in with the fingers. Just there's that one. Not quite. Okay, those are on there. Now I'm gonna go find a socket, and so I can get my big cheater bar on these bolts that holds these calipers onto the housing, and tighten those down good and tight, and then we'll be able to put the tires on. I got the bars and torqued down the bolts that hold the calipers on, the brake calipers on, and then I took the cover off of the differential and washed the differential out and the cover out, got those pretty well cleaned up, and then put the differential cover back on. I put 8 quarts of 75-90 amps oil, gear lube in there, and that's going to be, I got enough to get it up to the stick, but I need a couple more quarts, so I got to run to town to get a couple more. Anyway, I jacked the thing up and took the jack stands out of it and set it back down on the wheels, and I just torqued down the axle bolts. So yeah, the rear end here is ready to go. I add a little bit more oil to it, but looks good, so I'll go ahead and warm the truck up and go to town and get some more oil, and then that'll warm the engine up and the front end up enough to dump the oil out of the front end to change the oil, because that's the next step. I'm done with the back end now. I got to turn the truck around here in the hangar and bring it in frontwards and drain the crankcase oil and the filters and fill those back up, and you got to change the turbocharger and grease the front end.